The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, data scientist David Shor on why Democrats need to connect with a changing electorate. Researcher Charlie Eaton on why student loan forgiveness would benefit those with the least wealth. Plus, Bill Press with journalist Neil King on his nearly 300-mile walk through American history. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. David Shor is a political data scientist and Democratic strategist. Looking ahead to 2022, he says shifts in the traditional Democratic electorate will require progressives to find the messaging that can reach across ideological divides. And we say hello to David Shor, head of data science at the progressive nonprofit Open Labs. David, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You know, you've devoted much of your career to electing progressive Democrats, and you're using data to do that. What does data offer in this context, and how should it play into designing successful political campaigns?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the single biggest problem in Democratic politics is that the people who choose to work in progressive politics and the people who care a lot about politics are very different than both the kind of people that we have to persuade and also, frankly, the kind of people that we have to turn out to vote. There was a great study that was done in 2012, a long time ago, but I think it's still relevant, where they surveyed volunteers for the Obama campaign and employees for the Obama campaign, and then also surveyed undecided voters. And they saw that, 1/3 of people who worked in the Obama campaign listed income inequality as their greatest issue. And it's, personally mine. It's why I work in politics. But only like 1 or 2% of undecided voters, listed it as their biggest issue. Now, to be clear, undecided voters, they care about the cost of living. They care about a lot of things that you can code and work with. But I think, the realization that elections are decided by people who don't follow politics very closely and don't have very strong ideological beliefs one way or the other is really important. And data helps us kind of step outside of these biases. What my firm does is we do tons of experiments to figure out what actually persuades people and what doesn't. Randomized controlled trials. We read people messages. There are control groups that don't read messages, and we kind of model out the difference. And I think it's really helpful just because what we've learned, at this point, we've tested thousands of different advertisements, is kind of, first of all, 20% of the ads that we've tested make people more likely to vote for Republicans. And a simple theory of change is identify those ads and don't show them to people. And, something that I really noticed, and that's what I think highlights the need for, rigorous quantitative thinking, is that the more people in the office like the ads, the worse the ads did, because the kind of people in the office, are in their 20s, they're highly educated, they live in cities, and the median voter is 50 years old and doesn't have a college degree. I think that means that if we want to talk to swing voters and get them to embrace progressive ideas, we have to actually test what works and what doesn't. And so I think that data helps us kind of step outside of those biases and make better decisions.
Those are some interesting numbers that you bring up. And, looking at what the data tells us, what it's telling you, what would you say are Democrats' biggest electoral strengths and weaknesses as we head into 2022?
Well, I think that the interesting thing here is that how stable a lot of this story is, both across time and across countries, that if you really look, generally speaking, people trust the center left on a certain set of issues, things like healthcare, education, improving the work lives, the lives of the middle class, improving race relations, and then they trust conservatives on issues like crime and immigration and taxes. And so I think a lot of the battle of politics is that if the public conversation is on something that involves empathy, whether it's healthcare or education, or to be clear, if it involves, having greater rights for Black Americans or Hispanic Americans, empathy is fundamentally the strong suit, of the left. But if you have the conversation turn to something else, fear of crime, fear of inflation, then the right has a benefit. And so, if we look through what our strengths are, I guess, to say them again, I think it's concrete policies that Democrats have that help people. And I think that there's just kind of this idea that, liberals care about helping people, but maybe they're a little naive about how the world works. And conservatives can be a little heartless, but they're willing to make the hard choices necessary to protect your family. And so I think that just making sure that we don't fall into that trap, and focus on these material things that can help people, then I think we'll be in good shape. And, I think that so far that's been really borne out. Joe Biden, he's proposed two bills so far that are literally the most popular bills, that I've tested. And I think that the Republicans have really spent a lot of this cycle talking about things that voters don't care about. I like to joke, the trick to winning elections is that you talk about popular issues that people care about using language that people can understand. And, Joe Biden is out there promising a very large number of jobs, and Republicans are kind of talking about critical race theory. And so far, I'm really happy with how this has gone. But obviously, Democrats have made big messaging missteps before. And so hopefully we keep it going.
It's got to be a lot tougher to be a candidate nowadays, because clearly we've seen some shifts in the way that people think. And in an interview with The Intelligencer last July, you made the observation that, and I'll quote here, working class white people have an enormous amount of political power, and they're trending towards the Republican Party. How do you explain this trend?
It's a great question. The important thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. isn't isolated in this. Basically the story of center-left politics in the West in the past 60 years has been that every country in the world has gotten much more educated, in the past 60 to 70 years. I think this is the biggest underrated trend in, politics and honestly in society. If you go back to the 1940s, less than 5% of the population had a college degree. And now something like 40% of people who vote have a college degree. And that's just a massive, massive change. And as this has happened, the college-educated people have gone from being more conservative than the overall population to being more liberal, while working-class people have, done the opposite. And this has happened here. It's happened in France. It's happened in Germany. In Britain, really all over the world. This trend has been happening, and I think these two things are linked. I think that basically, college-educated people and non-college-educated people live really totally separate lives. Other than race, it's the single strongest thing that determines, social segregation. So you have people living in totally different social circles and totally different neighborhoods who have completely different values on, things like race, on things like gender, on what you're allowed to say and how you're supposed to talk. I think it's unsurprising that the political system has kind of taken advantage of this divide and exploited it. But I think that this is even though this is, a natural trend that is kind of happening everywhere, it's a demand side phenomena as opposed to a supply side phenomena. Trump didn't do it, someone else would. It's in the interests of the progressive movement to fight this, and to try to swim upstream. And, Barack Obama did this. Barack Obama is the only Democratic president in both 2008 and in 2012 who presided over education depolarization. Obama did better with working class white people than John Kerry did. And he did better in 2012 than he did in 2016, in 2008. And, I think that there's just a really important table I like to show people that if you look in 2016 and you cross-tab by issue belief, amongst people who agree with us on universal health care and disagree with us on immigration, Barack Obama got 60% of those voters and Hillary Clinton got 40. And that's the story of the election. And the way that Barack Obama did it, I think people forget, was in 2012, he really focused on this message of providing universal health care for people. And he really tied back even social justice issues. So I really remember clearly, he got a question about the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and he tied that back to economic fairness. And, I think that I'm not saying that, Democrats should ignore any of these issues. I just think that the way that Barack Obama talked about a lot of them, just tying this back to material impacts on regular people and not presenting ourselves as the party of highly educated people. I think that that's, the path forward to trying to resist this trend.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to David Shor, head of data science at the progressive nonprofit Open Labs. David, obviously jobs mean a lot of other things for people too. And in terms of, hey, if we can all be working, everything else will work out. Do you think a Green New Deal, which would promise a lot of newer types of jobs, would that be effective at regaining that white working class voter?
I think that jobs are a great message. One of the big things, and I was really excited, the only bright spots of the 2020 primary for me was just watching how many people embraced a jobs guarantee. That's one of my pet projects. I think in polling that we've done with Data for Progress, it is a shockingly popular issue. I think we found something like 60% of people, support it even after, and actually for economic policies, that's like quite a bit. And I think there is something really fundamental about jobs. It sounds really trite, but I think that there are a lot of people out there who can't find work always. And I think that even the most conservative people will say, oh man, if someone wants to get my cousin a job cleaning up some parks or whatever, that would be worth a lot. So I think it's a powerful issue. When it comes to a Green New Deal, I think one of the tricky things about it, like the components of it, actually of let's create a bunch of jobs in order to help climate transition. I think that that's super workable. And ironically, I think in a lot of ways, that's what is going to be in the new infrastructure bill in various ways. But the actual branding, unfortunately, I think is now overly partisan. And so that's, I think the idea is very good. But I think something that's really tricky is that in order for things to be effective in politics, the median voter isn't particularly ideological, and so as a result, something I like to say is that you want to present your things in the most incrementalist way possible, just from a branding perspective. I think that in our world, we have really strong incentives to make things seem radical, just to get people to listen to us. But voters, again, 50 years old, doesn't have a college degree, probably has a mortgage. Like the median voter doesn't want radical change. They're like concerned about radical change. And you can see that, there's a Republican governor in Vermont, there's a Democratic governor in Kansas, and that's because, they were too flashy and voters reacted. And so I think if you want to do something like a massive jobs program, you just have to present it as make it dull as paint. And I think that's and I think that's almost more important than the substance. I think you can get the substance right as long as you make everything sound really reasonable. And that's actually something I think that, Bernie in 2016 did a really good job of. And it's one reason why he does much better, I think, among non-college whites than, other leftist politicians do.
It's funny that for a long time now, I have felt that the Democrats have really, really tripped themselves up a lot with their messaging, and the Green New Deal, I think, is a great example of that. You also mentioned the infrastructure plan. What do you think the effects of Joe Biden's recent infrastructure plan will be on the 22 and 24 elections?
It's a very important question. So, I think the important thing to remember is how Democratic administrations normally go. Obviously midterms tend to be really bad for whoever controls the presidency, but maybe this isn't a law of physics. Maybe what usually happens is that a president wins, has a trifecta, and then tries to pass a bill that ends up being super unpopular. This happened to Bill Clinton. This happened to George Bush in 2004. This happened to, obviously Barack Obama with the Affordable Care Act. And so, I think Joe Biden is trying a surprisingly novel strategy of let's make my signature agenda be popular, uncontroversial stuff that is hard to attack. And, I think he's paying dividends. Joe Biden has seen a much smaller approval decline since inauguration than, basically anyone else before. And if you can, and, some of that is because he's starting from a lower base because of polarization. But at this point, his approval has been pretty steady for 2 months. And at 55% or 54 or whatever it is, that's a pretty good place to be. And, I think that him picking uncontroversial, mostly economic issues to campaign, to center the summer around, I think is a big deal. Like if you compare where we are now to where Donald Trump was when he was trying to take away healthcare from millions of people, I think people don't realize, that bill probably cost Republicans the House. And so I think from a strategic perspective, I think that's the way I think about it, is that he's doing his best. COVID is actually kind of a big advantage, for Joe Biden. It's the thing people rate him most highly on. And as COVID becomes less salient, this is him trying to keep the conversation in a place that's good for Democrats, as opposed to letting Republicans, define what the media's agenda is.
Now, here's something I find pretty interesting. It's another trend that you've analyzed, and it's a shift among non-white voters away from the Democratic Party. Historically, obviously, that was something the Democrats could always count on. What is your understanding of why this is happening, and what do Democrats have to do to turn it around?
Yeah, it's helpful to start with numbers. In 2016, Donald Trump did slightly better with non-voters than Mitt Romney did. And a lot of people, dismissed that. They said, Obama's not on the ballot. But in 2018, the same thing happened, and that slide continued. Generally speaking, Democrats did about 4% better among white voters in 2018 than 2016, and Republicans did about 1% better with non-white voters. And that was pretty consistent across a bunch of different races, and that was really meaningful. If Bill Nelson had done as well with non-white voters as Clinton, he would have won the Senate race. If Stacey Abrams had done as well with Black voters as Clinton, she would be governor right now. And so, I think that was also something that people, kind of ignored. But in 2020, the shift was massive. There was a roughly 9% decline in percentage points among Hispanic voters, 14% in Florida. These are very large swings. And if you look among Hispanics, who were the groups that declined, it really comes to this question of ideology. That something that I think is very interesting is if you ask people, do you identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative? That actually doesn't vary very much by race. Roughly the same proportion of Black, Hispanic, and white voters identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative. The difference is that white voters are very polarized by ideology. Roughly 80% of white conservatives vote for Republicans and 90% of white liberals vote for Democrats. But among non-white voters, that's not true. Historically, Democrats have won non-white conservatives by very large margins. And, the story with Hispanics in 2020 is that in 2016, we won Hispanic conservatives by something like 20 points. And in 2020, we lost them by something like 30 or 40 points. And, that's the bulk of the story. And so I think, one way to think about why is this happening? It's easy to talk about any particular thing, defunding the police or socialism or whatever. But I think the big issue is that historically the Democratic Party has been a diverse coalition of, moderate and conservative non-whites and liberal whites, and also, many, moderate working class whites as well. But the story of the last 8 years is that as education polarization has kind of increased, college-educated whites have a lot of disproportionate power, not electorally, they live in the wrong places, but in terms of cultural power. They donate at higher rates. They are way more likely to work in politics. They're way more likely to run for office, and they're way more likely to work in the media. And so I think that they've successfully rebranded the Democratic Party in the interests of highly educated white people. And obviously, this has turned off non-college whites, But it's also turned off non-whites. Frankly, culturally, on a lot of different pieces of identity, working class white people and working class Black and Hispanic people have more in common with each other than they do with highly educated white people. And that's what I think is the danger of us turning progressive politics into kind of a club of educated people, as opposed to something that tries to materially offer things to a broad swath of the population. Because at the end of the day, 40% of the population identifies as conservative and only 20% identifies as liberal. And so if we just wage an ideological war, it's not one that we're well set up to win.
Mm-hmm. Now, your work, as recently reported by Politico, can put you at odds with some Democrats. And on some issues, your data suggests that the best political strategy may be to back off from some key progressive positions. And you kind of alluded to that earlier in our discussion. As a confirmed progressive yourself, how do you resolve the difference between what the data says and your political views?
It's an important question. It's something that all of us have to struggle with. The way that I see it, I feel very lucky, that I get to work in progressive politics, and I think that everyone who does it, we live our livelihoods, working in something that we get to care a lot about. But the reason we're doing it is that we're literally, being funded, and we're representing the 60 or 70 million Democrats who are out there trying to win. And whether or not we win is actually very important. I think, obviously, historically, the historical stakes, the material stakes have been high. When I started working in 2012, I kept having in my mind 30 million people will lose healthcare if I lose. But now that, we have Donald Trump and the rise of the far right, there's something much more existential at stake, whether or not we live in a democracy, whether or not, we all get, we get thrown out of helicopters. And so I think it's actually just very important, both because of the material stakes of helping people. Joe Biden has just decreased childhood poverty by 60%. It's a very big deal. And also because of the need to protect our democracy. And so I think that given that, it is very important to be clear-headed and to accomplish as much as we can without jeopardizing people. And so I think that there isn't an alternative to doing that. There is, but the alternative to trying to be strategic is just not being strategic and then accomplishing less. I don't like the fact that the current electoral system heavily favors Republicans and that we need to win 52% of the vote in order to win the presidency and probably 53 in order to win the Senate. But those are the facts. And I think there's a real danger. I think a lot of people in our party look at what the Republicans do and are jealous. And I agree. It would be amazing if we could win elections with 48% of the vote. I would have very different I would make very different strategic decisions. But we're not in the position they are. And as a result, we have to be a lot more careful.
Donald Trump, was he the wake-up call that Democrats needed?
I hope so. I think the good thing about, it's too early to tell, as it's like the Zhao Enlai quote about the, French Revolution, where I think that the positive thing about Trump for the Democratic Party is that he massively increased interest in politics, to a level that's never been seen before, which is why both 2018 and 2020 were record turnout years. And I think contrary to the narrative, in both of those cases, that record turnout benefited Democrats. And I do think that there are some advantages in that going into 2022, our base is much more energized and our base is much more educated and more likely to vote in elections. So we'll have to see where it goes. I do really hope, I think that in Democratic politics, there's traditionally been a lot of status quo bias, a lot of, refusal to implement, solutions to partisan gerrymandering or to try to fix the bias of the Senate. And I do hope, that the Democrats realize how big the stakes are. We only very narrowly beat Trump. We won the tipping point state by 0.3%. And had that not happened, had we done 0.3% worse and just gotten 51.9% of the vote, we would be living in a very dark world right now. And so I just hope that everyone realizes that that threat is still there, and that, we still need to be careful and do everything we can, to keep us from being in that position again.
Absolutely. David Shor, head of data science at the progressive nonprofit Open Labs, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Please, anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, correcting the myths about who benefits from student loan forgiveness. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Herd immunity is important in stopping deadly viruses, but in politics, the herd instinct can send a whole species over a cliff. Witness the frenzied herd of Republican governors now stampeding behind the scaremongering scheme of Texas Governor Greg Abbott to use the personal suffering of Latin American migrants and asylum seekers as political pawns, rather than helping find a humane solution to the very real plight of these desperate Latin people. Various governors are following Abbott in confronting the migrating families with keep-out military-style force. First came Ron DeSantis of Florida, strutting around in a mucho-macho photo op, pledging to send a small hodgepodge of deputies, highway patrol, and even wildlife officials to Texas for a few days. What will they do? Who will direct them? Who would pay? DeSantis didn't know. Then came Cornhusker Governor Pete Ricketts, proclaiming that Nebraska is stepping up to help Texas respond to the ongoing crisis on their border. But local public officials who are actually on the Texas border say there is a problem, not a crisis, and helter-skelter squads of clueless gendarmes from afar won't help. Still, the hyper-partisan governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds, said she was sending a few state troopers to Texas to defend, quote, the health and safety of Iowans. Interestingly, she had refused a request this spring by the Biden administration to help house migrant children crossing our border to seek asylum, coldly declaring, this is not our problem. South Dakota's Kristi Noem also piled on, dispatching some of her state's National Guard troops to Texas. Oddly, though, Noem's troops were not sent as true agents of the state, but 25 political mercenaries paid an undisclosed sum by an out-of-state right-wing billionaire. This is Jim Hightower saying, to monitor this fraud, go to NoBorderWallCoalition.com. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. A college degree has long held the promise of being the great equalizer, but student debt is only serving to widen inequality. That's why researcher Charlie Eaton says ending student debt is a powerful and progressive way to advance economic equity. And we say hello to Charlie Eaton, assistant professor of sociology at University of California, Merced. He's also the author of the forthcoming Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Rise of Finance in U.S. Higher Education and Society. Charlie Eaton, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Now, you and several co-authors recently co-authored a study for the Roosevelt Institute, and its title is Student Debt Cancellation is Progressive, Correcting Empirical and Conceptual Errors. What are some of the main errors you wanted to address when it comes to canceling student debt?
Yeah, a couple of the biggest ones are that folks who have said student debt cancellation isn't progressive, they primarily model the distribution of debts that would be canceled by income rather than wealth. And if you actually look at the distribution of student debt by wealth, what you find is that folks on the very low end of the wealth spectrum disproportionately hold student debt. And folks at the very high end of the wealth spectrum, the top 10%, 20%, 30% of folks who have wealth have very few student debts, if at all. And so it's important to distinguish wealth and income here. Wealth being the assets you hold, like the home you might own, or the stocks you might own, versus income being the money you're paid by an employer or the money that you might make on some of your investments.
Where do these
and then a second.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then a second really important mistake is that folks don't disaggregate by race. And that's especially important to do because racial wealth inequalities are even greater than racial income inequalities in the US. And so if you don't disaggregate by race, you don't see that Black and Latinx borrowers disproportionately have student debts and make up a disproportionate share of the low end of the wealth spectrum. And we can get into this more, but that means that sometimes when you see that folks who have middle or upper middle incomes that also have student debts, those folks are actually tend to be more commonly Black folks who are trying to make their way into the middle class, but who come from very low wealth households and low wealth family backgrounds.
And so where do these misconceptions come from?
Yeah, I think the misconceptions come from a sort of, a mythology that people had when they created the student debt system, the student loan system. Folks thought, well, this will be a way that people who have means can pay to go to college. But in fact, people who come from wealthy backgrounds very rarely borrow to go to college today. If you look at folks in the top income brackets, only about 30% of their kids borrow at all to go to college, whereas folks from lower income backgrounds and low wealth backgrounds borrow closer to 60%, and Black households borrow at the highest rates.
Now, your study sought to correct these errors. So what did you do differently?
Yeah, so we took this data. It's the latest data from the New York Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finance. And we did what I described earlier. We measured the distribution of student debts by wealth, by household wealth. And so what we found was that folks who are in the bottom 10% for household wealth, Black borrowers had over $17,000, or rather Black households in that bottom 10% for wealth had over $17,000 on average in student debt. White individuals had over a little bit over $12,000 in student debt in that bottom 10%. But then if you go and you look at folks in the top 10% for wealth, they only had a little over $500 across all races in student debt on average. And that low average student debt per person in the top 10% is because most the vast majority of people in the top 10% for wealth don't have any student loans at all.
Now, once you concluded your work, you wrote that far from being a regressive, student debt relief can in fact be progressive. Looking across just economic levels, what led you to that conclusion?
Yeah, so it's this finding that if we canceled student debt, you'd be canceling $17,000 per person on average in debt for Black folks in the bottom 10% of the wealth distribution. You'd be canceling over $12,000 on average per person among white folks in the bottom 10%. But you'd be canceling very little for folks in the top 10% and very little also for folks in the top 20 and 30%. If you go down and you look in that top 30%, it's still around just $1,000 per person that folks have on student debt, because on average, most of those folks don't have any student loans at all. And the other part of this is that we'd be canceling debts for folks who come from low wealth backgrounds, who are trying to build wealth for themselves and build assets for themselves, but they're not able to do so because they have student loans. They can't get a home loan. They can't buy a car. They can't necessarily find the job of their choice because they've got these resource constraints from having student loans. So it would do a lot to, it wouldn't directly do as much as we would like to reduce the racial wealth gap, but it could indirectly provide more pathways for Black borrowers to build wealth and close that racial wealth gap. And it could provide pathways for other low-income groups across different racial groups who didn't inherit household wealth to build wealth and do something about the real mobility crisis we have in our country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough to constantly be trying to dig yourself out of a hole when the hole just keeps getting deeper on you.
Let me just add one thing there, which is that this is something that we did not ask previous generations to do. We didn't ask folks in the 1960s or 1970s when college enrollment expanded at its fastest rate. We didn't ask them to take on these huge debts. If you look back in the 1970s, only 1 in 8 folks who went to college took on any student debt at all. Today, it's a majority of folks who go to college. And today, more of the folks going to college are from Black, Latinx, and low income and low wealth backgrounds. And so we're asking those folks to do something that we didn't ask a previous generation to do on their path to entering the middle class.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Charlie Eaton, assistant professor of sociology at University of California, Merced, also the author of the forthcoming Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Rise of Finance in U.S. Higher Education and Society. And Charlie, in terms of quality of life, what could student debt cancellation actually mean for those who could benefit the most?
It could mean a sea change. I think, one thing is just not worrying about the anxiety of have to repay these debts. Right now, we've actually had a moratorium, a pause on student debt payments for most federal student loan borrowers since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. That pause is set to expire at the end of September, which means a new economic burden of having to worry about repaying these debts. So I think that's just the anxiety. The psychological burden is substantial, but what we're learning more and more is that it's also something that prevents people from getting a loan to buy a home, getting a consumer loan to buy a car, getting access to consumer finance to do the basic things that really matter, and also having to, have a constrained household budget for just doing the basic things that we think are part of having a thriving middle class lifestyle. So by lifting student debt burdens through cancellation, we allow folks to live a fuller life, and it will contribute to the economy because they'll be able to themselves build wealth and themselves invest in themselves in ways that will enable them to do more to contribute to the American economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just it. And as you point out, I mean, that's better for everybody. And if we actually get to the point of real legislation, How should a debt cancellation policy be designed to do the most good?
Yeah, so this is actually something that doesn't take legislation. This is something where we don't have to worry about the Republican veto of just about anything, or the Republican filibuster against just about anything that advances racial equity. This is something that President Biden can do by executive order. And you can see that in the fact that the student loan repayment pause was done by executive order. Federal student loans for defrauded for-profit college students were canceled via executive action. And there's been extensive legal scholarship showing that under the Higher Education Act, through something called compromise and settlement, that the president has the authority to do this by executive order. So our co-authors strongly urge the president to do this by executive action, which is something that's supported by the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, as well as large numbers of Democrats in both the House and the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Beyond the impact on a single borrower's life, what can be the broader benefits of student loan cancellation?
I think it helps us, it brings us together as a society. It removes these barriers of wealth inequality that divide us, and helps people to thrive and grow their capacity to contribute to the economy. And, the one thing that can't be done by executive order that I would like to see in legislation, and that I think Democrats are thinking about how do they do this in the second recovery bill, the American Families Plan that President Biden has proposed, is how do we reduce student loan borrowing in the future? How do we provide debt-free paths to college? Because it's an imperative that we cancel student debts that are holding back a generation of borrowers. But it's also imperative that we not saddle a future generation of borrowers with debts the way that we have with this generation.
Absolutely. Charlie Eaton, Assistant Professor of Sociology, University of California, Merced, the author of the forthcoming Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Rise of Finance in U.S. Higher Education and Society. Charlie, appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
I'd love that too. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, a weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with journalist Neil King on what you can learn by walking through America.
The question I'm sure I want to start with, probably everybody starts with, so I love to go to New York for a weekend every once in a while. I just hop on Amtrak. It's I'm there in 2 hours and 45 minutes. I could fly up in an hour. Why the hell did you decide to walk to New York?
I think it has something to do with what you just said, which is that all of us who live in Washington or New York, we know all the quick ways to get from one place to the other. Everybody's kind of obsessed by how you can cut off 15 or 20 minutes if you take the train or this airplane. And one day, this was a few years ago, I was like, gosh, I wonder what would happen if I just walked out of my house and walked there. Like, how would I do it? What would be the path? Would it be fun? Would it be strange? And then I kind of started thinking, well, how did the old timers do it? How did the colonials do it? How did people do it by horseback, for that matter? So the more I kind of looked at that, the more I realized that there was a lot in between that was actually worth seeing. So my joke kind of became, I would do a slow walk through the fast corridor, the Acela corridor. And even though my walk didn't actually follow the Acela or follow I-95, it kind of went up in an arcing sort of parabola of sorts up above that, and then caught the Jersey Turnpike and stuff a little bit further north and went into Manhattan.
So let's go to the basics first of all. How long did it take you?
I set out on the 29th of March, which was fantastic timing, perfect beginning of spring. And it took me 26 days before I got to Manhattan. I just have to point out that like 3 days I was more or less stationary in Philly. And I spent essentially a day poking around in York, Pennsylvania. And I spent a day poking around in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So days of motion were about 20, but days of the trip itself took 26.
And you mentioned the route. So clearly you did not walk up I-95. You chose a route through suburban Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, right?
Yeah, I kind of
describe that generally. Obviously,
yeah. So I went straight up north of DC, up Rock Creek, up through Olney, up through northern Maryland, skirted Baltimore, went up across the Mason-Dixon line, whatever that was, 40 miles south of York. I went up a bit of the rail line that's very interesting and historic that connects Baltimore to York. Then I cut across through Lancaster County, the kind of amazing Amish Mennonite areas of Lancaster County. I went down through Valley Forge. I went to Philadelphia. Then I cut up to Doylestown. Anyway, then I cut across, I went across to Delaware where Washington did. You got to do that. And went to Princeton. Then I cut across New Jersey and up to New York, Staten Island. I very much wanted to follow the old way that Jefferson or Franklin or Washington or whomever, or anybody had to travel from Philadelphia to New York City. And I mimicked that route, which was very interesting. And
how long were you planning this trip?
I planned it to do it last spring, and then COVID got in the way. I was going to walk out the door basically the same day. And as we all recall, at the end of March, COVID was out of control and everything was closing down. So I ended up delaying it exactly a year. I do have to say that part, COVID was no great thing, but it certainly made the walk so much more potent and interesting. And, all the horrors of January 6th and the fights over the election and kind of our, various wrestles and tussles with ourselves as a nation and the whole issue of 1619 Project and our own memory and what do we memorialize or what memorials should we tear down? And all of those things that had happened in the year in between made the walk 2 or 3 times more valuable.
But just planning, your route, where you were going to stay, who you're going to meet up with, must have taken you months of planning, right?
It did, because one, I was not planning to camp out. So I had to find different kinds of lodging, which was not easy. Airbnbs, inns, occasionally like a motel and things like that. And I didn't want to leave all my encounters up to chance. So I had to plan various people to meet and figure out in some places where I should meet truly interesting people, archaeologists, historians, journalists, mayors, whatever. And those pre-planned meetings were really instrumental and really great. But the serendipitous meetings were in many ways the most magical. So it was a mixture of both serendipity and planning.
What did you take with you? I know you had a backpack. I saw pictures of you with a backpack. But,
yeah, I went super spare. I had about 16, 17 pounds in my backpack, 2 pounds of which were my laptop. I had one pair of shoes, walking pair of shoes from Ultra, which were fantastic. I had otherwise a couple of shirts, pair of shirts, pair of long pants, etc. I went super, and I had a fly rod and some equipment and fly fishing, but I went really, really spare.
One pair of shoes? You didn't take a backup?
One pair of shoes. And, if they got wet, they got wet. I went through some rivers. I did some fishing where I even used them as sort of my waders of sorts. And it was fine. It worked out fine.
Right. So you had some rivers to cross, too. You knew that ahead of time. Obviously, you didn't mention taking a kayak or a canoe, right? So,
I originally had a bunch of bold plans about trying to kayak down the Schuylkill into Philadelphia and things like that. But I nixed that for just as being too complicated. And but when it came to crossing most rivers, of course, there are big bridges for that. And that whole aspect actually was quite interesting because when you get to the Susquehanna, that is a huge, formidable, deeply important river in American history, one time frontier river. And now, of course, you blaze across it on a bridge, whether on a train or in a car. And I spent, I don't know, 45 minutes just sort of standing there when I got there at Wrightsville and just taking it all in. And those encounters with the big rivers were very powerful.
Were you ever afraid at any point on the trip?
I was not. The only thing I was kind of afraid of was distracted drivers and, stupid people. I was primarily on roads of differing sizes, and I almost always walked towards incoming traffic so I could see some, dunce if they were, driving on the shoulder of the road or something, which never really happened. I was pretty lucky, and I got very lucky on the weather because, walking in a heavy rainstorm along the shoulder of a road is not really well advised. So I didn't have to do much of that.
Right. So I happen to be a big fan of travel literature, and on my bookshelves, included in the travel literature, is a book by Paul Theroux, Kingdom by the Sea, Walking Around the English Isles. Eric Newby, a book called A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush. A guy named Patrick Lee Fermor, who walked from Holland to Constantinople and wrote a whole trilogy about it. Were you inspired by any of them, any of these sort of historic literary walks?
I was in many, many ways. One other one I would mention would be In Patagonia, the great Bruce Chatwin book about walking, taking buses and various things around Patagonia. That Patrick Lee Fermor book I absolutely love, particularly the first one, A Time of Gifts. The other thing that I was quite inspired by, they're not nearly as beautiful or literary as the books you just mentioned, but was all the travel logs that people like Alexis de Tocqueville, Charles Dickens, many, many, many non or less well-known people wrote in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the 19th century, who all came to the United States and took a very similar path that I took, trying to figure this new country out. And, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America is the most famous version of those books, but there were hundreds of them written during that stretch. And I downloaded pretty much all of them from the Library of Congress and at least read through portions of quite a few of them.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky as a friend to follow you through your your journal, online journal that you sent out every day. And I was struck by the history that you encountered and revisited, the sites that you saw, and the people that you met. Let's talk about each of those. Historically, what were the you met with historians all along the way, and just a little while ago you referenced this railroad track, which I found fascinating, having to do with Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yeah. So now I'm actually writing a book version of all of this, so I've gone even deeper on these things, and so this is one of the actual brand new first railroads ever built was the one from Baltimore that went up to York and then to Harrisburg, et cetera. And Baltimore was actually kind of the birthplace of the American railroad system. And this particular line happens to be the line that took Lincoln in November of 1863 to Gettysburg. And when you go up that way now, you come to this station called Hanover Junction Station. And it has a track that goes off to the left, which is the track that Lincoln took on his way to Gettysburg, where he actually paused at that station for a little while. And then the track that goes off to the right is the one that goes up to York and then to Harrisburg. And tragically, Lincoln took that rail line basically a year and a half later, April 1865, after he had been assassinated. And, the 13, 14-day trip that his casket took getting him to Springfield. And that was a very powerful place to be. And I just spent, 15, 20 minutes kind of mulling all of that while I was there. And there were a lot of encounters along the way that were like that, where you're in, these places that you give them meaning by being there, and they kind of give you meaning back by taking it all in. And it was pretty powerful.
You must have been places where Washington slept or allegedly slept.
As my trip went on, there was, of course, I was in the footprints of all those guys, and very much Washington. Also, a lot of Marquis de Lafayette in ways that were very funny. Hamilton, Thomas Paine, all that kind of stuff. So that became kind of an unavoidable theme. And I made a point. A friend of mine came down from New York with a couple of kayaks, and right there at Washington's Crossing, just a bit up from Trenton, we crossed the Delaware in the kayaks, which was really, really fun. And a whole group of hikers met me on the other side, because my walk became kind of a thing as it went. And a lot of people were noting it on Twitter because I was posting photos and stuff. I had a very long thread. And so I had a number of what I called road fans, of people who just encountered me along the way, which was really, really fun. Some of them added quite a lot to the walk, actually. They would walk with me and fill me in on details and stuff.
And did you find, it seems that you found that in some of these small towns, people are very proud of their history, right? And we're very eager to show you around.
Very, very much so that way, yeah. And, there were many things that really struck me about the nature of being a pilgrim and walking through a town or down the road and encountering people, and them, digesting, taking in the fact that you're on your way to a distant place, New York City. It just changed the way they would interact with me. And with basically only one exception, where I had a bizarre encounter with a strange character who didn't want to fill my water bottle.
Tell us about that, because I was going to ask you whether you found the people overall friendly.
Yeah, absolutely. But one day in particular, I was still in northern Maryland. I was walking through one of these, one-time farms turned into a sort of a sea of mini McMansion kind of places. And my water bottle was empty. And I came upon a guy in his 30s at the end of his driveway. And I said to him, instead of saying, "Hey, can you fill my water bottle?" I said, "Do you know where I can get some water?" And knowing, of course, that he had quite a lot of water in his house. And he described this long 2-mile walk to the nearest store. And I just sort of looked at him in bafflement. And we had a whole long discussion where I told him about the hospitality traditions in other nations. And we had a very interesting discussion. But even at the end of it, he never saw it fit to fill my water bottle. And I just found that pretty astonishing.
But he was the exception, you say?
He was, yeah. And it was funny because I called it the parable of the empty water bottle, became kind of an ongoing theme. And I told that story to a number of people along the way. And there were sometimes I would encounter people and I would say, "Hey, I wanted to ask you a question." And they would say, "Oh, yeah, but first, hey, do you want me to fill your water bottle?" Is that kind of thing. So, yeah, I had some fantastic encounters with people along the way in that way.
Did you meet any Trumpers?
I did. I think the funniest one of all was when I was in northern New Jersey. There's an area there kind of, 30, 40 miles south of Manhattan where it's very Trumpy territory. And it was funny because I came along the sidewalk. There was a guy's house. He had the, "Make America Great Again." He had a flag. His truck was all tricked out. And I was thinking, gosh, it'd be great to have a real discussion with this guy, because I haven't had like the full discussion. And miraculously, he just appears on his driveway because he was about to go on a walk, and he sort of sweeps his hand towards his truck and the flag and everything. And he literally says to me, "Does this provoke any thoughts?" And I said to myself, it's just like, how could this happen? That I want to talk to the guy. He comes out and then he says to me, "Does all this provoke any thoughts?" And it was funny because I said, yeah, of course it provokes all kinds of thoughts. I don't know if I necessarily really care to share them. It's maybe not as interesting to me as you might think or whatever. And he said, "Oh, well, hey, where are you going?" And when I told him, he, on the other hand, said, "Can I get you a water? Can I get you a beer? What about a Clementine? What about some bananas? What about some granola bars? So I said, hey, you said a beer. It's 5 o'clock. I'm walking. I got another hour and a half ahead of me. I'll drink a beer. So I did the proverbial drink a beer with a guy in his driveway. And not only did he bring me a beer, he brought me water, clementines, the entire list of things he had mentioned. And it turned out to be a really interesting and fascinating conversation. And, we held some views that I don't necessarily share with him, but there was a lot that I actually liked about the guy himself.
I was really struck by your encounter with the students at an Amish school, I believe it was.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Well, it was Mennonite school, and that was
Mennonite school.
definitely the highlight of the trip. I mean, I'll give you the short version. And this just testifies to the incredible nature of the difference between walking and driving, because of all the things I would never, ever have seen if I'd been driving. And I'm walking along a road, come by a Mennonite school. I can see just off to the side that there's a young woman, probably 8th or 9th grade. She's got dressed in a full-length floral dress with like a kind of a bonnet. They call them head coverings over her head. And she's got a baseball glove on. And I'm like, what? And then I hear the whack of a softball, and she backs up and catches this basically like a line drive, fly ball into left field. And I'm like, and did it incredibly well. And I'm like, what is going on? So I go back there, big playground, 2 huge, very aggressive games of softball being played, all by boys and girls, with the girls all wearing different kinds of floral dresses like that. This is spring's bursting out. These Mennonites are playing the most incredible game of softball. All the women are dressed like that. It was like this just extraordinary American thing, just out of like Norman Rockwell or something. I was just blown away. So the bell rings. They all come running over to me, as their teacher does too. He asks what I'm doing. When I tell him, he tells the kids to gather around, and I give them almost like a kind of extemporaneous chat, And then at the end of it, one of the young women says to her teacher, whose name is Neil Weaver, she says, Mr. Weaver, why don't we go sing for Mr. King? And he says, do you have time? And I was like, yeah, I have time. And so they took me into the school, into their choir room, and they sang 2 Mennonite hymns for me that were just over the top gorgeous. And this was their spontaneous way of thanking me for being there. And that whole moment, and I've been in touch with Neil, the teacher, and I actually saw him a couple of weeks ago. I was back up that way, and I spent an hour and a half talking to him and his wife and his family. And I now have all these like friends scattered throughout that whole region. It was really amazing.
Bill Press with veteran journalist Neil King. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Shor, Charlie Eaton, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.